Down the Barrel Podcast with Jimmy, Dino, and Jared.
Welcome back to Down the Barrel. We are here once again with the one and only Thomas Archibald Gable.
Wow, my title's improving every time I come.
No, that's definitely not your middle name.
No,
I'm actually really good at guessing middle names just by looking at people.
Go for it.
Yeah, this should be good.
Let's see it. What you got?
Thomas Gable. It's going to be like Thomas Henry or Thomas David.
Can I have a guess?
That's pretty good.
Peter.
Thomas Peter? No, I've got more faith in his parents in that. I'm going to go Thomas David.
We should ask what his dad's name was, or his uncle's.
You're close.
I'm close.
Sort of. It begins with the D.
Oh, Thomas gosh. Dean?
No.
God. Thomas Derrick. Thomas Devin.
I was going to say Devin.
This is definitely what our
people are going to be pretty jazzed.
Everybody tuned in to hear this. I know.
Thomas. It does start with a D, though.
Is it deer?
It's Thomas Deer Gable.
I knew it.
Thomas Gable.
Basically.
Now YouTube's going to block us again.
Right?
I'll have to beep that out.
Yeah.
All right. Final answer.
Starts with the D, man.
Thomas Daniel.
Close.
Ooh, that's good.
Thomas Donald. That's my grandpa's name.
Donald.
Anyway,
I was closer.
You were very close, though.
All right.
You were. Good try.
Yeah.
Good try.
You want me to guess yours now?
You know mine.
All right. We're back with Tom Gable from Voyageurs Wolf Project. Just getting updates on the project and, anything and everything new in the wolf deer population dynamic world.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Where do you want to start?
Well, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
And before the snowstorm,
right?
You braved
making the drive.
Yeah.
Yeah. I might die on my way back, but I got here.
Hey, it's worth it, right?
That's right.
Exactly. Exactly.
I had one day left on.
I'm going to feel really bad now if something happens to him on the way back.
Well, what would you
These
do?
These are his last words.
I mean, I would definitely want to spend it at DTB. That's for sure.
If I knew it was my last day on Earth, I'd say, kids, wife, I love you. I got to go record a podcast. All right. So let's start with, I think last time we left this off, we were talking about new funding that you had received to actually study wolf deer mortalities dynamics.
Sure.
Where are you at with that project?
Yeah, so that project just got started. So we started collaring some deer a couple of weeks ago, and that's really early on, so we don't really have many updates there yet. But the hope is it's a 3-year study. And so the hope is to track survival over, obviously, this winter and then the following winters and see basically what's causing deer survival to change, not only in terms of winter conditions, but also looking at predation levels, looking at habitat factors, basically the 3 things that, in theory, could drive changes in deer survival. So, and similarly, at the same time, so we're doing that with the collared deer, and then we have collared wolves, and we're actively studying their predation behavior during the winter too. So we sort of have the data from the deer survival perspective and then the wolf predation perspective. And sometimes those things might tell you, they all are going to tell you a story that, and they're going to be sort of 2 parts to the story, but they're going to tell you different parts to it, right? And so because the number, like deer survival, or let's say the percent of the deer population that dies from wolf predation every year is considered the predation rate. Well, that's going to be dependent not only on how many deer each pack kills, but what the density of wolves is as well. And so you were trying to get all the different components understood in this system so we can really track what's driving it. And even let's assume, or not assume, but let's say we find that wolves aren't necessarily having a sizable impact, but we are still interested in the ecological dynamics. Like we're still interested in what is wolf predation like during a really severe winter versus a really mild winter. What does that look like in terms of deer survival rates? What's the association between deer survival rates and growth rates of deer populations? So there's all sorts of, I consider them mainly just ecological questions that we're interested in of how does this system work? And having collared deer helps us understand that. And similarly, we're very interested in habitat and particularly deer habitat. As time's gone on in the state, deer habitat has changed and changed in dramatic ways. In particular, we have lots of young forest and we're losing a lot of conifer forest that deer need for the winters. And so we're really interested to look at it also just take the wolves out of the picture, just does where a deer decides to spend time, does that influence their probability of surviving, whether that's surviving getting eaten by wolves or surviving dying of starvation or whatever it might be. And there's good reason to think that there probably is some association there. It's just trying to understand that dynamic. But that obviously is going to depend on what does a winter look like. We had a very mild winter, but if we have a winter that lasts really long into April and May, deer are going to change their behavior. They're going to change where they spend time. And so we're hoping to tease all of that apart. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that truly in a 3-year study. That's fairly short for kind of our goals, but the hope is that gets us started. And then maybe it's something we can get additional funding for to keep building on, or find other resources to kind of keep that work going longer term. So it's really interesting. It's definitely a new area of work for us. Obviously, we've done really the wolf side of things for a long time. And this obviously kind of seems like a natural step to kind of, collar the prey and understand what they're doing as well. So we're interested, and hopefully I'll have some updates in coming years to share.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
How many do you have collared right now?
So we have 59 collared right now.
Okay.
And we're hoping to do more next year. Yeah. So the challenges with survival studies, which is why when you often hear about states, and it's usually states who do these large studies because you need to put out a lot of collars to really get a large enough sample size to understand them. And so it's not uncommon for state agencies that are doing this to collar 200, 250 deer or elk or whatever, right? Because you need large, robust sample sizes. Because if you only, let's say, collar 50 and 5 die, for instance, you don't know, it's very easy to kind of have a number that's not representative just because you don't have a lot of individuals on the landscape, because everyone that dies represents 2% of your sample size, right? Whereas when you have 250, 5 die, that's a very small percentage of your sample. So you get a much more accurate depiction of what actual survival is. Mm-hmm. So what we're focused on is how can we try to increase that sample size through time, either by catching deer or finding creative ways to get collars out. So we're thinking through that and trying to learn from other researchers who've done this. There's obviously a lot more people who've caught deer than have caught wolves. So luckily there's a lot of information there, and trying to just tap other folks of how they do this and learning tips and tricks from them.
Yeah.
So will that expand your outreach?
It'll expand it to an extent, but in some ways the deer study is sort of like its own. It's sort of combined with the Wolf Project in the sense that we're doing it in the same area, but we're not. It's not really. It's sort of its own thing that's running, right? And so right now we're kind of keeping just our Wolf Project, particularly our outreach is just our wolf research. Down the line as we get more information, we might start sharing things through that. But right now we're really focused on trying to keep them somewhat separate. They are and they aren't, but we're trying to kind of keep them separate at this point. So we have a postdoc that's kind of helping run that project now, specifically just the deer side of things, right? And they're not really helping, let's say, on the wolf side, except where it kind of makes natural sense, like studying wolf predation during the winter time or something. Mm-hmm. So, but down the road, it might be one of those things that is more integrated into our day-to-day work.
Cool.
Yeah, that's interesting. So when you say you're studying the habitat, what are you doing to study that aspect of it?
Sure. So what ideally we're going to do is, so all the deer collars, they take locations every 3 hours, right? So you're getting 8 locations a day from all these deer. And luckily deer don't move that much. They're not like wolves who are constantly covering huge distances. So they kind of stay put. And then we can use a lot of remote sensing data to look at forest type, forest, habitat type, age of the forest, where roads and linear features and other landscape, kind of get all these different landscape attributes and try to understand, okay, the deer is spending a bunch of time in these kind of areas with these characteristics. How does that compare to the overall landscape, right? Are they using conifer forests more than you would expect based on just the availability of conifers on the landscape? And do deer, let's say, who do that, do they have a higher probability of survival? So you can start tying in these landscape, basically determining where does a deer spend time and seeing is that related to their ability to survive, in those landscapes. So like I said, that's an ambitious goal because you need a large sample size to really tease that out statistically, because there's a lot of variables other than just what habitat did they spend time in, right? There's lots of other factors at play. So that's why we it's probably it's an aspirational goal to be able to answer that. But that's also prior to our work. There was research done by the DNR, kind of these pilot studies in the southern part of our study area in the Elephant Lake Deer Yard, where they were collaring, I think they collared about 30 deer a year for like 3 years, because they were trying to understand and assess the feasibility of looking at essentially that question: how does deer survival change with habitat use? Because there's been a lot of changes to the habitats in northern Minnesota. So we're hoping to get at that to an extent too.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is that change mainly driving the change in habitat?
Primarily logging practices.
Okay, that's what I assumed.
So I mean, it's the it's probably twofold. The one is that the rotation of logging has gotten shorter through time, and so as it gets shorter, we think about most of the logging is going after aspen in northern Minnesota, right? And aspen does not provide very good cover for deer. For the first maybe 5 years, aspen, like when the forest has been cut, that aspen provides good food for deer. Right. But then after that, it gets too tall, and usually there's not a lot in the understory of aspen stands. So there's not a lot of food, there's not a lot of cover. And so until that forest then gets to be 40, 50 years old, when you're starting to get conifers, balsams, spruces making their way into that canopy where it starts providing cover and starts becoming helpful habitat for deer, that aspen stand kind of becomes a deer desert. I mean, if you go out in a time, it's kind of like if I said, go walk out in the forest in the middle of the, when there's deep snow, and I said, okay, we'll walk through a cedar forest and now go walk through an aspen forest that's 20 years old. I guarantee you it's a lot more work to walk through that aspen forest, because the snow's so much deeper than it is in the aspen. And that's exactly what a deer's encountering too. So there was a quote or a statistic in the Star Tribune, which said that, this was in an article this past fall, that in 2012, 30% of DNR state forests were aspen stands older than 50 years old. So these would be sort of mature mixed forests that have good conifer cover. And now it's 6%. Wow. Right. So it's declined considerably. Right. And the problem is too, when you get rid of some of these, particularly some of these habitats that deer really like cedars, they're really not regenerating, right? They don't come back. So you cut that and it's not coming back to that, right? And then that's probably then once you cut it, that forest is probably just going to become in this 40-year rotation, right? And so what logging can do, and this isn't against logging, it's just a reality of how deer spend time, is that deer want habitats in northern climates and winters that have a good percentage of conifers. And people often think logging's good, it creates food for deer. Well, most of the study looking at deer diets during the wintertime in northern climates have found that actually deer moreover prioritize cover than food. And they do not go to the areas with high food because even in the winter, that browse, that food is not really that good of food anyways, relatively speaking. So they don't get that much out of it. So the effort needed to go browse young aspen or whatever isn't really worth it if they have to put in tons of energy to get there, because they're not getting that much off of eating little aspen buds. Even though it's better food than nothing, they're still losing. It's still a losing equation, right? And so they just decide to hunker down. So if you get rid of all the places to hunker down, or you minimize them, then you have deer who are relegated to much smaller areas on the landscape in the wintertime. And then you have, obviously that could influence predation, or at least some of the spatial dynamics. Like if wolves know, hey, all the deer just go to this spot because that's the only spot left for them. Well, that could potentially change some of those equations, or at least change how deer can respond to winter severity. So it might mean that severe winters would have a really bad toll on deer, but now we've changed the habitat in such a way that now actually that impact is even more severe than it would have been, because instead of deer being scattered across the landscape in a bunch of little patches of conifers, it's just like, well, there's one deer yard. They all go there. And that's kind of what we see in some of our areas. Like there's one deer yard and then you have 3 packs that are all kind of anchored around there because they're going to go where all the food is too.
Right.
And then there's areas where you're not going to see much deer sign because there's no cover. And that's one of the things I talked about in our webinar. I was showing some photos of our study area from the air, and you can look at some of these areas that have been logged. And like, if you were a deer looking for conifer cover, you would not find very much in a lot of these areas for very large expanses because there's just not conifer cover. So the ideal deer habitat would ultimately be sort of mixed age stands that have conifers, that have, let's say, aspens that get old and fall over, and then they create gaps, and there's browse intermixed amongst these conifer stands, or really dense conifer stands like cedars that have young habitat right next to them. So they don't have to expend energy. They can basically go in and out of that cedar forest. Okay. Obviously, though, that's it's still a challenge to kind of get the cedar forest with young browse next to it's a challenge, because if the deer congregate in that cedar, unless you're cutting young keeping that forest young perpetually, eventually that forest is going to grow up around there, right? And so you're not going to have that. So probably a better way to do it would be to have a lot of mixed age forest, where you have older forests that are 50, 60, 70 years old that get more of that conifer component, and then they have a lot of stuff in the understory too. So that's an important part of the equation. And this is something that's not like no biologist, if you asked a deer biologist in Minnesota, like, does that surprise you? Wouldn't surprise it. That's been work that was done, published in the 1980s, 1990s. There's forest management plans for deer in Ontario that state that same thing. So this isn't like a new finding that we've learned. This is just a summarizing of what people have known for a long time. And some of that comes from people who did some really tedious, boring work where they basically followed deer tracks and looked at the trees to understand their browsing patterns in the wintertime, which would be, I think, super dull. but the information is really interesting, because what they found in a lot of these is that food isn't ultimately the limiting factor for deer in the wintertime. Like there's a lot of food that deer didn't take advantage of. And so that points to like their strategy is conservation of energy, not eating food in the wintertime. Okay. And so they just hunker down and just wait it out, right? And they get enough fat reserves in summer to hopefully be able to persist.
My next ambition was going to be to follow deer around and see what they do, but now
someone's already done it.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
I know.
Okay, well then I'll follow turkey around.
No, I think this is this really speaks to why it's so important for our DNR, Division of Wildlife and Forestry, to work hand in hand, right? Because they haven't always, and I think they are making a very concerted effort to do more of that. The DNR statewide forestry convention, or whatever they called it, was just a couple months ago down in Breezy Point, and they actually invited a bunch of us to come down and give a presentation, a bunch of conservation groups. And that, I think, demonstrates that they are, as a division of forestry, starting to think more about these wildlife considerations. Because, like you were just saying, Tom, if you're consistently, perpetually harvesting like that first generation pioneer species and not allowing that forest succession to really take place, like that's an unsustainable practice, right? Mm-hmm. And so we got to find ways to do that. And you mentioned your webinar the other night, and I appreciated the shout out we got on there with an article that was in our Whitetails magazine. Where have all the deer yards gone? Which was a great piece that was published, 2 years ago or so. Because we are, I think, truly relying with our current model on the few deer yards that we have left for these winter thermal cover for our deer population. And we've got to really reconsider if we have enough right now, because I would argue that we don't.
And I think the other thing too is like we've got this understanding like deer need yarding areas, right? Which they need conifers, right? But they don't necessarily need, like, they could make do with a lot with areas that aren't just, let's say, just giant chunks of cedar, right? Like that's good cover, but like there are lots of ways that if we just let forests get older, you could add high quality habitats back on the landscape in a lot of places, right? But that means you're going to have some areas that you're not going to cut, right? Or you're going to cut at a lot longer rotation so that those species can get old. But having a more sort of scattered, or having more scattered conifers across the landscape is undoubtedly going to be good for deer in the winter time. And that's something that we don't have a lot of right now. And I think until that's changed, like that's a really important dynamic, and people like to get fixated. I know we're going to talk about wolves, and that's the topic that people get fixated on. And I'll obviously share my opinions of where I think, we might get wolf management, whatever. I don't think that's going to change a lot, but a really meaningful way to help increase deer populations is looking at habitat considerations. And that's often, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to get the traction or enthusiasm that, let's say, wolf management does. But actually, I would argue it's actually probably far more important on a large scale, but it's a lot harder to conceptualize, right? Because it takes a long time to grow a mature forest, right? And that's not going to lead to an immediate, like, hey, we stopped logging these chunks for, and then in 20 years, it's going to be good conifer habitat, right? It requires sort of this long-term vision of what we want things to be. And we might not see it immediately now if we get those changes. But I do think that there's a lot of reason to suspect that there are ways we could make much better habitat, which could make deer more resilient to winter weather, to predation, et cetera. But obviously that comes down to really some large, I would say, value-related questions of like what, state land, county land belongs to the citizens of that area. What do the citizens want for those resources? I mean, and if people feel strongly that they should be managed this way, then they should share those perspectives, right? And if not, obviously the dominant perspective right now is forests are a resource, which I'm not disagreeing with. I mean, I think unless you don't use wood, it's pretty hard to be against logging, right? But it's thinking through, okay, are there ways we can modify these practices that both allow getting sustainable timber at a reasonable rate while also ensuring the interests of species like deer. And they're not the only ones that benefit from these older forest types too. I mean, you have lots of other animals that require old forests that we don't have.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And that's why a significant amount of the habitat work that we do as MDHA is focused on that thermal cover. And you said, it doesn't always get the excitement and the energy around it, the habitat work. I would go a step further and say that I'm often met with like animosity,
Oh, sure. It's like the scapegoat.
Why are you restoring the habitat just to give the wolves a better home?
Right.
Like you got to think about it from, all angles, right? Like it's an ecosystem, right? It's not just wolves eat deer, end of story, right? There's all kinds of variables that come into play here. And our goal as an organization is to address each and every one of those variables in a way that is as impactful for our wild deer herd and for our hunters and conservationists as possible, right?
Right.
And thermal cover is, I think, probably the most important.
I think the thing that's the challenge, I think, like you're saying, is I think the moment you say this is an important thing, a lot of people that, at least from my experience, are like, well, you're just trying to not blame the wolves. And
right.
It's like
a scapegoat.
It's like, well, not really. But I also tell people, like, you go out in the woods and go run around in March and tell me which habitats you would prefer to run around in. And let's assume something was chasing you. Tell me which of these habitats you would want to run around in. Do you want to run around in the young aspen forest, or do you want to run around in the cedar forest? And I think people oftentimes dismiss it until you really start, like, go out and be active yourself in those habitats and see the physiological change that happens when you're trying to move in one habitat versus the other, and then do that for 5 months or 4 months and don't eat anything, right? Because that's essentially what a deer is doing. And so I think when people dismiss it, it's because they haven't really thought about it from a deer's perspective of what is that actually like. Certainly predation is one of it, but even without predation, you can read about this in the Dakotas in like 2021 and 22, I believe, or maybe it was the following year when they had a super severe winter. They estimated there was a 50% die-off of deer. They don't have wolves there, that they were just finding dead deer because they were basically nutritionally depleted and they didn't have anywhere to go, right? Because it's just so taxing to move in those environments when you have deep snow. So I do wish I've thought about ways like, how do you get people to see that habitat? And this isn't unique to deer. I mean, I think this is a lot of people, conservationists, who are trying to say habitat's important, right? But it's just not as sexy as some of the other things, right? And it's like, how do you get that to resonate with people to understand, this is an important thing.
Right.
And you hear people know habitat's important when you talk about food, right? When you say food plots and things like that, and people are like, oh yeah, we need nutrients in the summer to get to see a deer. People often don't think about that in the winter, that habitat change, particularly in northern climate, shifts, and you have to think about it differently. But actually, the winter is probably more important than the summer in terms of dictating whether a deer makes it through to the next year.
Yeah.
Well, and
Go ahead.
I was going to say, even with habitat, we've noticed in the area that we hunt, and I think a lot of hunters ignore this or don't want to realize it, that the logging, or if, habitat's changed in their surrounding area, they want to blame something else.
Right.
Like we had a stand that was cut not too far from where we hunt, and it changed how the deer, move around. And there was a year that's like, where'd the deer go? Well, now they're kind of coming back. But after that first year of the cutting, they weren't around. They moved, they changed their patterns. And I think too many hunters have been complacent, be like, well, I've hunted here for 30 years, but it's like, okay, yep, you've always had wolves, you've always had this, you've had severe winters, but what else is going on in your surrounding area? What are you doing to help your habitat out? If you're not doing anything, somebody else is doing something else, and that's what's affecting you.
I think that's exactly the point. I think particularly with hunting, right, is people want to put a stand up and hunt that stand every year for 40 years. But that habitat is becoming very different through time to how a deer perceives it, whether it's, especially if it's like getting logged or not logged and things like that. And there's some spots people have stands like, this is a horrible spot to hunt. Like it's like a 20-year-old aspen stand. There's not a lot of food. There's no cover. So in the fall, it's like, why is the deer going to be here? Like there's really no reason for it to be here at all. And we actually found this when we looked at where wolves were hunting and killing deer fawns in a study we did where we looked at basically trying to understand where do wolves actually kill the fawns and where are they trying to hunt them. And we looked at forest age. That was one of our variables there. And what we found is that wolves were far more likely to kill deer fawns in stands that were aspen stands that were young, less than 5 years of age. But once the stand got older than 5 years of age, there was no signal that wolves were killing deer disproportionately there, or that wolves are actually traveling in those environments. So they were seeking out these young forest habitats because that's where there's deer in the summertime. But then once they get old, and once those aspens get old enough, they just don't yield good deer habitat. And I think people sometimes forget that too, because if you went hunting, let's say a couple years after an area was logged, like, maybe in the fall you're going to have deer there because there's going to be a lot of young stuff there, but it's quickly going to get 10, 12, 15 feet and the deer aren't going to be able to touch it, and then they just don't have food. And so they have no reason to be there. So people who will set up, like I know at least up north, I'm guessing it's the same here, when areas log, people that are very quick to get a tree stand somewhere in that spot, right?
Yep, right away.
And then it grows up and then they're cutting little lanes through it, right? And it's like, and then they don't see much and they're like, oh, something's happened here. It's like something has happened here, but it's not wolves. It's just that this habitat was good and now it's not good for deer at this time, and you got to move around. So.
Yeah, but Uncle Ben shot one 22 years ago. Biggest buck he's ever seen.
And I think that's part of it. I think it highlights why if you don't have private land, if you're on public land, you have to be, if you're going to go hunting, you have to be willing to move around.
Right.
You have to be willing to
don't you dare tell me how to deer hunt. I want to be as lazy as I want to be.
Right.
I still want to be guaranteed.
If we just got rid of the wolves, you could do it.
That's right.
Exactly. That's the problem.
I want to sit my fat ass in the same deer stand and shoot a trophy buck every year.
Yep. And I don't want to do anything to my own habitat around me.
Right.
They've always been here.
That's right.
I don't have to change anything. Why can't the deer change?
That's right. Just come to where there's no food.
Or shelter.
But we're going to get in trouble for this one.
I mowed a trail.
But I mean, this is the kind of information I think people need to hear.
Right.
Is that there are reasons for what you're seeing, beyond what you're being told by certain folks.
100%.
And 100%. I mean, we agree that wolves are, one of those reasons.
Right. And they should be addressed.
Right.
Exactly. I mean, we're not speaking on behalf of Tom.
Sure. No.
I think Tom would agree that they can sustainably be, harvested. But, we're aiming to mitigate each and every factor at play here. And I would argue, again, thermal cover, habitat is the number one factor.
And maybe that's on us. We need to better educate folks that why these things are important and what they do.
We've been doing it for 45 years. And, the people that listen, they signed up, and apparently only 20,000 people listen. Because that's all.
I get it.
That's all we can seem to get on board here.
Just keep pushing.
We just got to keep pushing. So we got to do.
Right.
I think the other thing you're up against with some of the habitat stuff too is there's a lot of, let's say, obviously when it comes to forest management, there's a lot of commercial interests in it, right?
Right.
And there's this notion too where you have companies talking to landowners, et cetera, trying to say, make your habitat better by letting us log it, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not to say logging can't, in certain prescriptions, make better habitat, right? But like just clearing your land is not going to make your land long-term better habitat. Right. But you have this challenge where people that is particularly, I'd say, in the hunting community, people feel like, oh, I need this young forest, can be good for grouse, good for deer, and for a little while it will be. But then after that, it's not going to. And so you have this challenge of trying to message that to people who've heard a different message from other sources and assume that, the company telling me if I log my land, it's going to be better habitat. If you ask them, why do you think that? It's like, well, because they told me it would be, right. Where's the actual evidence that says that that's going to be the case? So there's some messaging challenges, I think, too, there where people get differing sources of information.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's, I think a common theme that we'll talk about a lot tonight is, there's a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different values in play in all of these discussions. And I would say that we are also very much in a time in human history where instant gratification is the only gratification. And that's something that we need. And I think conservation groups do an excellent job of preserving the traditional value of, preservation for the future, conservation for the future. But that's maybe where we're across the board seeing a decline in membership, is because we aren't the organization that's going to give you the instant gratification, until you win your gun at your first banquet or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty gratifying.
That is gratifying.
But the work we do, it's not really something that you necessarily are going to reap the benefits from, right? It's something that your grandkids are going to reap the benefits from.
Right.
And that, I think, is more noble and more worthwhile than most other missions.
Exactly.
For sure.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was going to say that, we're not here saying logging is bad. I come a family of 5 generations of loggers. So, it's something that has to be done. And I've been told for years and years that, those logging cuttings that's gold for deer hunting. Mm-hmm. And maybe it is for that moment.
I think it is. Like, I think the thing is, you can't say it's there's certainly not any evidence that it's like that logging as a whole is bad for deer. Forest disturbance, deer do like young habitats, right? The difference is like there's a balance of deer. Most studies have indicated deer like a good mix, right, of both conifer and young forest, right? And right now, northern Minnesota, a lot of it is not a balance. It is largely young forest or aspens. And so you're losing that balance, which is the problem, more than like, oh, we're cutting trees. I don't think that's the issue. Is how we're maybe going about it or thinking about it, right? Let's say you went to cut forest and all you were interested is deer, right? You'd probably design that a lot differently of how you think about logging that. You'd probably be, okay, we'll keep this big conifer patch here. We'll maybe cut a little strip of young forest here. You would design it very differently than, hey, we're just going to clear 60 acres and cut everything, right? Yeah. Which is a lot of what the logging is. You'd maybe be more selective, make it patchier, which would more mimic, let's say, some natural disturbances, right? Where you have wind throw events, you have a forest fire, things like that. So I think it's not to say that logging is bad. It's like in the same way I made this point in the webinar that I gave, is like I used Voyageurs National Park as an example of what their forest looks like now. No logging, right? And it's really different than outside of it. And it's largely, it's largely a mixed forest with a lot more conifers in it. But that also isn't, let's say, ideal deer habitat because there's no disturbance or very, very little disturbance, right? So there's a lot of aspects of that if you were trying to, let's say, have more deer on the landscape, that isn't the ideal either. So the other end of the spectrum doesn't necessarily yield you better habitat either. It's somewhere in between, right? And that's the challenge, is finding where's that balance? And then how do you, obviously there's an economic aspect to logging that you have to factor in, and what's feasible economically, and things like that. But I made this point, which is why I referenced the MDHA article, which was by Tom Rush, who was in the DNR. And what I'm saying is just ultimately mirroring what many DNR agency biologists have said about what habitat we need and the changes that are going on. And when the state had deer habitat specialists, essentially they're saying exactly what I'm saying is we're losing forests with conifer components in them that we need. So it's certainly not an anti-logging. My dad and grandpa run a millwork business, which is all based on logs, right? So I use firewood to heat my house. So I mean, there's just it's not an anti-logging thing. It's more just saying like we have to be realistic if we're going to talk about what's the issue or what are the issues here, and give an honest assessment of those. And we can't assume that everything in northern Minnesota has just stayed the same since the good old days when there's lots of deer and now there's far fewer of them, and assuming that it can't be habitat. It must be something else because habitat has changed considerably based on all the records that are out there.
I think we can agree, though, that Smokey Bear deserves life in prison without the possibility of parole.
I certainly agree with that. I mean,
he should definitely have a talking to, I would assume.
I think we have a bear season.
Well, there you go.
I mean,
that's taking it a little far, Dean.
For those that don't know, Smokey Bear, not Smokey the Bear, Smokey Bear. Only you can prevent forest fires, right? And forest fires were good back in the day, right? They were routine surface fires. They were not destructive. They promoted regeneration. And we started just suppressing every single one. And now you get a forest fire and it becomes this destructive crown fire that, is just horrible for the ecosystem, right? But like you were saying, Tom, that disturbance is a good thing, right? But disturbance at a certain scale is a good thing, right? And that used to be handled by things like forest fires. And now we're trying to prescribe what the ecosystem would have done on its own through, thinning and clear cutting in some cases. And it's never going to be as good. And that all goes back to that damn bear.
That damn bear.
That was an interesting sideline there, Jared.
Was that a sideline? I felt like I
don't know that we were thinking about talking about Smokey Bear.
Well, no, but we were talking about disturbance and
it tees into it. I mean, it would be. I mean, if you thought about like every lightning strike in northern Minnesota that's put out, right? Which admittedly, obviously, no one wants their cabin to burn or their house to burn, right? So
absolutely not.
But like, let's say a lot of those are allowed to burn, and you had small burns. Like up in Voyageurs, when they look at historical tree core records, they found like every part of the park when they did this had burned about every 20 years from a moderate sized fire, or not even moderate, pretty small fire. But then every 50 to 100 years, there'd be one large fire, right? But if you think about, that's this landscape where this was periodic, right? Routine, right? And obviously we didn't have deer up there. But even if you talk about other species that, like young disturbed habitats, you would have a lot more of this. But you'd also have old habitats too at the same time, right? So you had the ecosystems were probably a lot more complex at those times than they are now, where we have a lot of habitats that are all in a similar state, right? They're all young habitats, right?
Right.
So I do think like fires would change that. Same thing with wind throws and things like that. You don't see as much disturbance from wind when you have younger forests because the trees are smaller. Whereas when they come through and they take out lots of big trees, that creates a lot of gaps, a lot of young habitats and things like that. So, and you're starting to see some of that, like in Voyageurs National Park when we do our work. Some of those forests now are getting to be 80, 100 years old, and you're now seeing winds come through and take out these huge aspens. And it's awful to walk through, but you're starting to see now, there's these pockets of disturbance, and now you have young forests coming up in those areas where it was mature. So we obviously have tinkered with that equation. I think it's more just figuring out, what's a good way to try to accomplish all the uses that people want out of habitats, right? And we need trees, obviously, so you can't just say, well, it's just not logs so we have better deer habitat. That wouldn't work either. So it's trying to find that balance. And I think it just seems like that balance might have shifted really to one end recently. So
that's what I said, right?
I think Tom said it better.
Yeah, but you were close. It was the spirit of what you were saying.
Smokey Bear. So, I don't know.
Yeah, he needs to be rotten in a jail cell.
All I know is when Tom's here, we all sound smart. Well, he makes us feel smarter. I don't sound any smarter by any means.
I just interpret what you're saying and I make it sound better.
Exactly.
We really appreciate that.
Words.
We really appreciate that. Go ahead and laugh, but it's true.
Let me take this fifth grader's paragraph and turn it into a thesis.
I know what he's trying to say.
Exactly.
I appreciate you said fifth grade.
I know.
I was actually good with that too.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes I think my kid has more eloquent thoughts than you two. And
God, I would hope so.
yeah, I would do kindergarten yet.
I would too.
Yeah.
I did take him to see a bird show recently. We're getting real off topic.
We are. And it's okay. We
Right?
can do that.
Yeah.
Tom doesn't mind.
I got to take all three kids to see a raptor show,
Really?
which they just absolutely love.
You got to love raptor shows.
right?
I just recently took two of my older kids down to the Science Museum in the cities.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, they loved it. It was great.
And yeah, they had so I love birds, right? And I feel like I should know the answer to this, but I had never heard of this bird, but a rough-legged hawk.
Oh, yeah. They're pretty common sometimes.
It's different than a sharp-shinned hawk.
Do we have them around here?
You see them in the springtime, if I'm thinking of...
Because they're an Arctic bird, but they come down here in the winter.
You'll see them like flying around like farm fish. Go like the Saxon bog or something like that.
Yeah.
You'll see them flying around and then they leave, obviously, once they migrate. So, yeah, so you'll see rough-legged
we must
hawks.
not get them in Colorado.
I don't know about Colorado.
Because like the woman, the bird handler was like, this is a rough-legged hawk. And I was like, does she mean sharp-shinned? Because like that's what I was used to.
Yeah.
But no, it was a rough-legged hawk, which was really cool. We got to see a turkey vulture, also very cool.
Those are cool.
And a great horned owl.
Ooh, I love those.
I see a lot of those over in my place.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's really off topic, but
It's extremely off topic.
the kids
But I love
loved
it.
and it's on my mind because they've been asking nothing but questions about birds. And I think I'm thinking of it because I was talking about how he's already smarter than you guys. It's because the kid has such good questions about these birds.
I'm gonna have to start looking
know?
at the birds' legs to see if it's
I don't
fluffy
know.
or
You're
skinny
gonna
or
have to
whatever.
get pretty close to that bird.
Right. All I know is a red-tailed hawk.
Me too.
Red-tailed, they're great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's easy. They have a red tail.
I got to hold one of those.
Yeah, they're cool.
I had a friend in Colorado that was, what do you call it? When
Bird catcher.
No, when they hunt with
The falcon.
hogs. Falconry.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yep.
thank you.
That's so
and
cool.
he had a red-tailed, and so he would come sometimes and like do demonstrations for the kids and everything.
That's cool.
Okay.
But anyways,
So are you done insulting us now that we're done?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the rough-legged wolf.
Roughly.
That's one of the subspecies of Minnesota. So.
It's his new one, right?
It's a rough leg. Yeah. So today I seen that Voyageurs posted on Facebook about how predators, coyotes and wolves, hunting those might not necessarily lead to higher fawn success rates. I don't know what the word is.
You're a liar.
Blasphemy.
How dare you?
Yeah, I mean, this was...
What are you saying?
This takes us back to the old billboard discussion.
I don't know what you're talking about. I had nothing to
Sponsored
do
by
with
Jared. But yeah, I mean, so one of the reasons is we were trying to think about topics. So the first webinar we gave was looking at wolf deer interactions on a large scale. And then one of the common thoughts, or some folks think that like, oh, if we got rid of, let's say, coyotes or we get rid of wolves, we're going to somehow increase fawns, which are then going to in turn increase the deer population. And it seems like, oh, that seems logical, but in the natural world just doesn't work that way. And the reason why is because there's a notion of compensatory mortality in deer populations, which is the same reason why we can shoot bucks in northern Minnesota and no one's concerned that, oh, we killed this many bucks, we're going to decrease the population by that much. Because implicit in a lot of North American wildlife management is the notion of compensatory mortality, which is that a certain percent of this population is not going to survive regardless of what we do. And so if we hunt them, that is going to, in essence, mean that because we killed these deer, there's other deer that are going to ultimately survive because we're assuming there's limited resources. There's sort of a people call it a doomed surplus in the population that's going to die one way or another. We're just changing what they die from when we hunt them, right? And it's sort of the same thing with fawns. And there's been work that's shown this with deer fawns, where, let's say in northern Minnesota, based on fawn survival studies, or at least the two most recent, fawn survival is about 45 to 49%. There's a study here in the Grand Rapids general area and then also up north that found those survival rates, which is obviously not high, but it's actually higher than fawn survival rates in a lot of places where there aren't wolves. There's places in Appalachia where it's like 15% or lower. But what was really insightful is there was a study done, I believe it was in Delaware, in an area where there weren't any predators. So they collared fawns. And the idea was that, if there's no predators, these fawns are going to make it, right? And what they ultimately found is that their fawn survival rates were still about 45% because these deer were dying of malnutrition, other disease, genetic birth defects, things like that. And basically the conclusion there is that, and there's a great article by the National Deer Association that covered this research study that did it. And they called the study, I think it was like One Hoof in the Grave, or Born with One Hoof in the Grave,
yes,
which is basically the point that, like, if you get rid of predation, it's not going to necessarily mean that these fawns are going to make it. There are some instances where, like, alleviating predation could increase it a little bit, but nonetheless, the assumption that all these deer are just going to survive if we just got rid of the predators is just kind of flawed thinking, because ultimately deer populations evolved over a long time with predator populations, and they evolved in a way to be able to grow despite predators being around. And probably historically, deer had a lot more predators than they currently have with wolves and cougars and bears and all sorts of things. And so they've adapted these mechanisms to, ensure that there's enough fawns survive, they can reproduce, they can grow. It's also why deer give birth to fawns all at the same time, is because it's called predator swamping, where you basically dump all of your offspring at once, because even if the predators target them, it's sort of like this, like, flood the zone with young. And so a certain number will make it through, even though a bunch of them won't. And so these are all strategies to essentially overcome predation. But the assumption is, so that's kind of why they've adapted these. But the research basically shows that, if you got rid of predators, you'd still have high rates of fawn mortality. And the only thing so then there was another study that was a meta-analysis of all, which is basically just a study of all the studies of fawn survival in North America. And that was done, I think, in 2017 or 18. And what they found is that the only thing that increased fawn survival rates was the percent of agriculture in a deer's home range. Basically, because if you think about it, that's basically increasing the nutritional quality of the deer, which means they're going to have higher survival. But there really wasn't an effect of, you're in wolf habitat, you're in coyote habitat, or whatever. There was very little to indicate that if you don't change basically food, you're not going to really see a considerable increase in fawn survival rates. And I think you could also say, too, when you look at predation, it ultimately is not realistically feasible unless you're going to do it at such an enormous scale to, like, kill predators year in, year out to keep those fawn survival rates happening. And so that's the other challenge you have too, is there's also this side with the predators. If you think about how many wolves or coyotes or bears, let's say we can show that they're having an effect on fawn survival, right? And let's say we got rid of all of them, we could increase fawn survival rates by 15%, right? Well, how much of that wolf population or coyote population do you need to kill before you start seeing that little bump? Because it's not like, hey, I killed 10% of the wolf population, fawn survival increases that much, right? It just doesn't work that way, because predators are competing with one another as well for resources. And those resources are fawns. So there's a certain other level too on the predator side where it's not as simple as I'll see this online. I killed one coyote, I saved 5 fawns, right? Like, that's just not the way the world works. And that's hard for people to wrap their mind around. That doesn't mean you can't shoot coyotes. Like, you can shoot coyotes. It's just the notion that you're going to help deer fawns considerably is pretty low. There have been some spots, particularly with coyotes, where they have done these mass coyote removals, and they have seen temporarily little bumps in fawn survival. But that does not persist if you don't keep doing that year in, year out at a level that would never really be sustainable, let's say just via recreational hunting and trapping, right? So my sense is, like, it's really not a legitimate, it's just not going to be feasible, really. And I think it's sort of accepting, like, predation is a part of the natural world. And even if we kill a bunch of predators, we're not going to change that dynamic long term. And the other part, with wolves specifically, people think that if we get rid of wolves, we're going to increase it. Well, the problem is, you get rid of wolves, you're going to have other predators are going to come in and fill those voids. And wolves actually, in almost all the fawn survival studies done in wolf range, they're usually like the third or fourth predator. If you rank the ones that kill the most fawns, they're actually lower down. And it's not because wolves aren't good predators of fawns at times. The reason is that wolves occur at much lower densities than most other predators do. They occur at lower densities than bears and than coyotes. So the average wolf might kill more fawns than the average coyote or the average bear, but there could be 10 times more coyotes than there are wolves. So if you get rid of wolves, you actually might make the problem worse if you're trying to do it, because you may be removing one of the things that's keeping another predator population lower than it would otherwise be. And so that's what we see in the eastern US now. We have coyotes where you didn't have coyotes historically because we got rid of wolves. And coyotes can be very abundant, and obviously they have no problem killing deer fawns either. So there's also that aspect of it where, like, if you start killing wolves, if we get a wolf hunting season, for instance, it's really not going to change anything in terms of fawn survival. Or I would put considerable money on the fact that it would not change that dynamic in any meaningful way. Again, that doesn't mean you can't shoot wolves. It just means you have to try to look at the evidence of what you actually see when it comes to predation and its effects on deer fawns.
And to be fair, you cannot shoot wolves. Just want to put that
Yes, you cannot shoot wolves now. I'm saying hypothetically, if you could.
You can shoot coyotes
every day of the week.
That's right.
And I think the other thing too, it's worth noting is, like, also just because you increase fawn survival, let's say you could increase fawn survival by 10% by getting rid of all the predators on the landscape, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that the population is going to increase by 10%, because that doesn't mean all those fawns, doesn't mean that all the other deer are going to continue to increase at the same rate either, because there are, without using really fancy words, but I'm going to have to, there's density dependent forces at work in deer populations. Basically means as the population gets denser, they start competing with each other more for resources. And so then oftentimes growth rates of most mammal populations decrease as the population gets larger at a certain point, because now there's more competition for the limited resources, and that helps regulate populations at the level that can be sustained on the landscape. So just because these fawns make it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole deer population is going to increase by 10% necessarily. In the same way that saying, like, if we got rid of deer hunting, which would mean we'd have thousands of more bucks in northern Minnesota, I don't think next year the population would increase by that much, because it's not that simple to just say, well, we stopped hunting, there's 10% more deer in November than there were in October. I don't think that means there's going to be 10% more come April. And so you have to use that same logic when you think about fawn survival as well, as it's not that simple.
Right.
So feel free to plead the fifth or tell me to go pound sand.
Pound sand.
But if you were to make an argument as to why there should be a wolf season in Minnesota, you're arguing there should be a wolf hunt. What would your argument be?
If I had to make an argument, and I'm not saying this is backed up by the facts, but if I were to make one, I would say...
Don't say values.
It is values. That's really what it would be. I mean, that's ultimately, like, I think you can't, there's no other real, like, every one of these points has sort of the counter perspective that someone could argue the same. So, like, let's say people often want to say, well, let's say we can prove, and this is why wolves and deer, I think, are such a hot issue. In some senses, it's this struggle over values. Like, some people think if we can prove that wolves are impacting the deer, that justifies the hunting season for them, right? And someone on the other side of the spectrum could say, well, great, they're impacting the deer. Deer do damage to forests. People hit deer with vehicles. That's actually a positive for society. Why should we hunt them? They're doing us a service. So it really comes down to your perspective. I'm not saying that's what you should think. I'm just saying, like, you can flip each one of these issues based on your perspective and come to a very different conclusion. And that's why some of it, and we take lots of heat for our perspectives on wolves and deer, but some of it, it's like, it doesn't really change the ultimate reality of it. It is your values of what you think. I could give you lots of reasons why we could have a wolf hunt that isn't going to decimate the deer population, decimate the wolf population. But I don't think that means that we should do it. So, like, I can same way I could argue with you, like, these are the reasons why we don't need to hunt any wolves. And from an ecological level, like they'll do their own thing, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't mean we can't, right? So I'm going to give you an answer that's not very helpful, because I think it's like, I could see it on both sides. And I think that's ultimately why there's so much arguing about it. If it was so obvious, right? The majority of people would coalesce and just say, yeah, we should. It's obvious we need to do this, right?
Right.
But it's not that simple, because two people look at the same pieces of information and make very different conclusions about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wouldn't say that answer was unhelpful or a non-answer at all. I don't remember which word you used there, but
I don't either. So
no, I think it was a very fair answer, and I think it's the same one I would give. It really does come down to values, right?
Well, I think it does.
And you can argue with the data all day long, but that's not going to change the data.
Right.
So
I think it's fair.
And I think the thing is, people and I think that's the issue with wolves and deers is almost singularly, I think, unique when you think about it, because it's like the only species where people try to justify having, let's say, a hunting season by proving they're impacting another species. Like, you don't hear that when it comes to bears or fishers or beavers, right? No one's screaming. If I said, actually, beavers cut less forest than we initially thought, no one views that as a threatening thing to beaver management, right? Because it's not really a statement about the values. But people with wolves and deer, it's like, that's this litmus test for the value. Like, what are your values?
Right.
And that's why it gets people angry or upset, as opposed to like thinking about it like this is purely a scientific question. And it doesn't have to be a statement of what you should do. Like, in the same way, I also don't know, like, are fishers impacting the red squirrel population? I don't know, probably not. And even if you could show they're not, is anyone going to advocate for we need to stop trapping fishers? I mean, I don't hear that discussion on social media, right? So it's all about perspective. And I think with deer and wolves, it's just this symbol of this much larger struggle over what values are.
Right,
and unfortunately, that's become the litmus test for where you fall out on that issue.
It has, for sure. And personally, at a bare minimum, I would like to see delisting, just so that Minnesota law could immediately go into effect, and you could take a wolf if it was threatening your pet or your livestock.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah,
I mean, there are some very practical, and I think that is in some sense, like, delisting has multiple components to it, right? And I think a lot of times people immediately go to, there's just the hunting component of it, right? Which obviously does end up becoming a discussion when it comes to state management. But there are other aspects that could alleviate some issues associated with that, because I think most would agree, even people who probably don't want wolf hunting, that it's probably beneficial if a farmer is watching his animal get attacked to be able to remove that animal, right? That's a problem.
To me.
And I think that you'd have things like that. I don't think you'd get as nearly the amount of disagreement on, right? I think it's ultimately what comes in is like that part. I think you'd have broader support for. I think it's like, how does the hunting side of things come out? That's I guarantee you that if all the states said, we will not hunt or trap wolves if they're delisted, they just said that, I bet there'd be very little arguing over wolf delisting, right? Because it's not, because right now you sort of have you really have two options for wolf management, right? It's either they're totally protected on the endangered species list, or they come off and they're immediately shot. And I'm not saying that means their populations are estimated, but I mean, that's really it, like, time to start killing them, right? And that's really it. And the only thing that prevents it or keeps it on one side or the other is essentially the Endangered Species Act, right? So I think I think anyone could probably reach that similar conclusion when you look at it, like, it is a way to keep certain management perspectives. But I think people often fail to say, like, what if the state just didn't do anything just let them be? I don't think people would be arguing about it. I don't think you'd have lawsuits. I'm not saying that's what should happen. I'm just saying, like, when you think about really what is the core issue for a lot of people, that's what it comes down to.
So do you think wolves, let's say wolves in general, or just wolves in Minnesota, do you think they meet the criteria under the Endangered Species Act? Because it is the Endangered Species Act. It's not the Charismatic Creatures Act.
Well, right? I think the problem that is true. I think the problem is with the ESA, and I think the problem is it's policy, right? There's like sort of a biological component, but there's also the biological component on a national level versus a state level, right? And the ESA is a national law, right, or piece of legislation, and that's ultimately what, from my understanding, and I'm not a policy expert, a lot of the discussion is at when it goes to court now is essentially our wolves, have they recovered in, I think the word is like 95% of their range or their historic range, right? And that's essentially the discussion right now. Certainly on like a pure biological level, I don't think there's any biologist who would say that wolves in Minnesota, having 3,000 wolves, are going to, if they get delisted, are now on the verge of being endangered, right? I just don't think that's in all accurate. But I think I think it's different to separate out, like, are they biologically, let's say, endangered in the state versus like in a legal sense, are they endangered per the rules that are specified in that piece of legislation, right? And I think ultimately that's the argument. Obviously, wolves have been delisted in some states, and there still are wolves there, even despite some pretty aggressive wolf management policies there. That doesn't mean for sure. I mean, there are some indications potentially that might be done at a level that is, if they continued indefinitely, might not be perfectly sustainable. That wolves might, and there is a point at which you can kill enough wolves to start causing serious population declines. But given Minnesota's plan, that seems very unlikely to happen in Minnesota. I would say almost certainly not going to happen in Minnesota. Right. So, and in Minnesota in particular, their management plan stipulates that even if there were to be let's say a hunting and trapping season, that they want to keep a wolf population that's similar to what it is now. Right. And so they would manage it accordingly. So I think it's so important to parse out, like, endangered is a loaded word because it has different meanings depending how you think about it. And particularly on the legal, I don't claim to understand it well enough to know on a legal level what constitutes being endangered, threatened, or things like that, because there's no like biological term of, if it's this, it's categorized as endangered or threatened, right? I mean, I guess we could all say, if there's 10 of them left, that's probably pretty endangered, right? But it gets gray, which is obviously what's being argued about. Yep. That's the challenge. And that's the whole thing with even the Endangered Species Act as a whole, as I understand, is lots of species get listed and few get delisted.
Correct.
And so there's just some larger questions too there about how does this work, right? And I don't have those answers. Unfortunately, you've reached my knowledge. I mean, my limit of my knowledge. So
right. Mine was reached the first minute and a half.
Right. And this is what, your third time on here? I think our knowledge was expensed about halfway through the first one.
Definitely, yes.
2 minutes.
Absolutely.
2 minutes.
Yeah. Yep.
It's the first time you said kilometers.
I don't know. He uses a lot of big words. And it's funny because when you're talking over there, I had this brilliant idea for like a mobile app.
Oh, yeah.
And then you threw a word out that I was like, I might call it that. And the word was density. So I'm thinking.
Is that a new word for you?
No, that one's not, but it reminds me of how dense I am. So it was like, I need a translation app for like smart to dumb or smart to not so smart. Well, however you want to say it. It's like when he says big words, it explains in our ear. That means, this. Maybe that exists already, but I thought it was a great idea. And I'll have to credit Tom for that.
There we go. Inspiration.
Density. I don't know.
Density for dummies.
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I kind of want to go back to what you said about how wolves and deer are kind of unique, that we kind of base it on each other.
Yep.
And I think that goes to, how, at least in our area, how much deer are part of our society.
Sure.
In hunting. And I think that's where in our area I can speak to, that's where a lot of that comes from. And then I think it also speaks to how people argue about it. It's more of a, and I don't know if this is the right word, I might need you to translate, societal, that's the argument. You can't ignore that part when it comes to management, unfortunately.
Sure.
It's the human nature of it, I guess you would say. I mean, so how would you say we deal with that? I know you were more the scientific, the biological.
Sure.
But that is real too.
Sure. Oh, certainly the societal part is actually, I would say, the most important part of when you think about when you think about management of most species, ultimately, like that is what is the driver of whatever the policy should be, right? It's what is society on the whole want with that species, because I think that's the whole point we're trying to get across some of the wolf and deer related stuff is we don't see a lot of data to support the idea that wolves are the key factor impacting deer populations. But again, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't hunt wolves or that we should hunt them. It just simply says like you can kill as many wolves as you want. If they're not the driver of this dynamic, it's not going to change anything. That doesn't. So I think there's the balancing that out. Now, you could also, someone make the argument, well, it's silly to make management decisions for a cause that isn't actually happening, right? Like something that just to appease people. I'm not making an assessment on that one way or the other. We do all sorts of things that might not be sensical. So ultimately, I think when it comes to wolf management, I think what it should be is like, what do people want? And that's a discussion of like, do people want to manage wolves the way that a lot of other fur bears are managed in the state? Are wolves managed differently? Because they are, in some ways, they are a normal other species, but they are also, I think you could make a pretty good argument, fairly unique, given the feelings they generate amongst the public. And so I think that's what it should be. And from my perspective, I think there's no inherent contradiction between there being an abundant wolf population and having good hunting opportunities. Like, and I know that's going to shock people to say that, but I don't think those things are in conflict. I know a lot of people do think they're in conflict, right? And I'm not saying that doesn't mean people can't advocate for the changes they want to see because they think that's going to help things. I'm simply saying, as from just purely looking at the information, I don't see any way that's going to, like, killing wolves is going to change that dynamic. And that's why I don't see a contradiction between hunting and that. Like, I very much enjoy hunting, and I truly don't believe when I go out, and I sat this year, didn't see a deer. I saw a wolf though, so I can say I've seen more wolves than deer this year. But I truly don't
you and
think
everyone else I've talked to.
That's right. So, but I truly don't think, like, when I'm out there, it's not like, oh gosh, I'm glad I've duped all those people online to thinking wolves aren't the problem. But actually, I know they're the problem. So I genuinely don't see a conflict there, because I don't think I'm fairly convinced, just based on the information, that they aren't in conflict. But doesn't mean that everyone's going to feel that way, and it doesn't mean that people can't advocate for what they want. I could remain cynical of saying to do it for this reason isn't going to make a lot of sense. But
let me translate that. Let me translate that, because he just said your feelings don't change the facts. There you go. That's a good translation, I think, of what you just said. Yeah, and I agree with that. That's kind of the point I was getting at.
And that's the crux of wildlife management, right? Is you've got your raw ecological data and knowledge, and you've got this human dimensions side of things, right? And you've got to try to find a way to mesh the two in a way that works for everybody. And, I will acknowledge that sometimes it is fucking frustrating.
It is a struggle, for sure.
It's frustrating. But that's the beauty of this country that we live in, is that my opinion matters just as much as the person that wants to just come up north and photograph a wolf, right?
Absolutely.
I get one vote, they get one vote. We have to tally those votes equally and make an informed management decision that's going to honor those perspectives in a equitable way,
equally beneficial way. Yeah.
And it's frustrating. It can be very
frustrating
because I have very strong opinions on things, right?
Well, as most people
that doesn't negate your opinions, right?
Well, and I think the other thing too is there's a lot of people on both sides of the discussion who are very ignorant, and I'm not saying that as like I think everyone, like, people I hear all the time, oh, the people who like wolves, they just are don't know what's going on, right? And then I hear people like, oh, these hunters don't know what's going on, right? And it's like, that's true of a small proportion, or at least a proportion on both sides, right? There's a lot of reasonable people who are also in the middle. You don't usually hear from those people. Right. You're not going to hear those people screaming and yelling. Right. But those are ultimately, there's probably a lot more people in that middle ground that are willing to at least have a discussion about it. And I think that's the real problem, is we don't have a lot of discussion. There's lots of yelling. There's lots of people insulting each other, as opposed to like people being able to actually have meaningful conversations about what they value, what they want, why they want, instead of just demonizing each other for, I can't believe you think that way, you know,
Right.
you're an idiot. And I think it would be really beneficial when it comes to wolves. And this is what we've tried to highlight in some of like our webinars of like getting people to really focus on the issue at hand, which is your values, not arguing about the science says X, Y, or Z or this or that and whatever, because both sides just say the same thing, right? The science supports our perspective and it really doesn't support any perspective, and trying to get people to have discussions about like, why don't you like hunting? Why do you like hunting, right? Why does that value matter to you, right? And trying to get people to really connect on a personal level about those things, because it's a lot easier to like, it's a lot easier to dislike someone's values if you can just demonize them as a person, as a whole. They represent everything that I don't like. Right? They're an existential threat to my views,
Right.
as opposed to like, that person's actually all right, even though I don't understand why they think that way. Or maybe I understand now because they've told me, still don't agree with it, but they're not a bad person for thinking that way. Right. I think
I'd like to say that about Dean. He likes the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah. Which makes him a bad person.
That's what I was thinking.
That's funny. Who has the most Super Bowl rings?
Bad people.
Can't we
Sorry
all
to
just
interrupt,
get
Tom.
along? Man, can't we all just get along? Why gotta be like that?
But we accept you.
Yeah. I'll get along with anyone until they bring up the Chiefs.
All right.
Super Bowl.
Not this year.
Not this year,
Not
buddy.
this year, but let's see. Where did the Vikings?
Hey,
did they? make
Our
it?
ex-quarterback won.
yeah, they were close.
Boom.
X.
Boom. Yeah.
X.
Right?
It's pretty close, though.
Hey, if my ex-girlfriend got an STD, she got it from me.
That is no lie.
And using that logic,
Yes.
that was basically Minnesota Viking. Win.
Yeah, pretty much.
right.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Sorry to go off topic there, Tom.
Yeah, that's fine.
but I have to poke fun at Dean from time to time.
No, that's fair.
Right.
I'm used to it.
He is.
But no, I think that was a very fair assessment of kind of where we are in this wolf debate.
Well, yeah. And it's, I mean, honestly, in a broader sense, society too. I mean, I swear to
Exactly.
God,
Yeah.
it is.
With the exception of, for now, mathematics, you can take all the information in the world and every single person is going to do something different with that information.
Right.
And science is
Right.
no exception. I hope that we can all agree what 2 + 2 is.
6.
We can agree what it is, but how you get there nowadays is different than how we used to get there.
That's the problem.
My God, I saw.
Or is that we're just assuming that's right because that's what they've always told us. Right?
Exactly.
Right.
It's probably,
That's
it
true.
actually is probably 6. We don't know. That's what we were told.
No one can know.
Nobody can know.
Yeah, it depends. Are we talking 2 apples and 2 apples? Because then it's 4 apples. Are we talking 2 wolves and 2 wolves? Because then it's 10,000 wolves.
Because
that's a
that is
valid
definitely
point.
how that works.
That is
And
a
those 4
valid
wolves
point.
eat 20,000 fawns divided by
Each
12
day.
times pi.
Carry the pie.
Yeah, and then
Carry
there's
the pie.
parentheses and a semicolon in there somewhere.
And then you get an
Right.
MDHA billboard.
Yes.
Tom just has to throw that in there.
That's a low
Ouch.
blow.
Ouch.
All right, hitting below the belt. All right.
It was too easy.
But that might have been the equation that was used there.
yeah.
I
saying.
think it was.
I think it was Dean, so it's Dean's
Divide-
fault.
Yeah.
Divide a coyote and a roadkill.
Watch out for that black ice on your way home. Oh man. Well, what else do we got to talk about?
Yeah, what else is new up there in Voyager country? You're studying the wolf, you're studying
Studying the
deer.
wolves, studying the deer. I mean, right now we're doing our winter time is largely we follow wolves around, find all their kills in the winter time to quantify how often they're killing deer. And then we're also doing our population estimates. So we have 400 cameras out. We're checking all of those all the time, making sure they're working. That's for getting our pack and population numbers. So we have really good estimates there. So that's a ton of effort. We're going to these cameras every 3 to 4 weeks to make sure they're working in the winter time. So that's a huge effort to do that. That's pretty critical to our work. Yeah. So, and then that's really what we're doing right now. And that's what we're going to be doing till April, basically. And yeah.
Can I take us somewhat off topic again?
Yep.
It's not about birds.
That was
it's not about birds. It's not about birds. But is there, so you get all these 400 trail cameras out there and, however many thousands, tens of thousands of images that you have to sift through. Is there a current and or perceived future role for AI in your research?
So, I mean, no doubt there probably is to an extent. It's more figuring out, particularly with the video side of things, how to do it. And particularly, a lot of trail camera work is interested. Like, there's a lot of folks who've used AI to speed this up, particularly with photos. Researchers put out cameras, they take photos, and then they put it in some algorithm that can identify the species, right? What we're doing with our camera footage is a bit more detailed than that, because what we're trying to do is not only determine the species, but we want to know, okay, what wolf is this in this pack? What age class is it? A pup? Is it a subordinate? Is it a breeding individual? And to be able to identify that same individual through time. So in theory, I mean, obviously we as people can detect, if we study it long enough, like, oh yeah, that's that same wolf we keep seeing, right? And we know that was the same wolf that was in that pack last year based on these physical attributes. So in theory, it does, it seems totally feasible that AI could figure that out. But right now, I'm not aware of anything that's easily implemented for us to like feed it all through an algorithm that can say, this is the same wolf in all of these images. So a lot of it is just us going through it. And it's kind of like watching film, like if you're like you would with like football film or something, you just watch the clips over and over again in the hopes of being like, oh yeah, I noticed this feature on this animal. Because some wolves, a lot of them do. Some of them are very obvious, some are not. But, with our estimates, we want to be able to say not only we know how many wolves are in this pack, but we know who all the individuals are. We know what they look like. We know if they were there last year, if they were from another pack and joined that one. So we're trying to get really high resolution information that, at least right now, is not something that you can readily get. And same thing too with like, okay, is that a pup or an adult wolf, right? And those, there are certain physical features, and I'm sure you could train AI to recognize those, but that's not something we've done, yet. So it would expedite it considerably because, when we get done at the end of the winter, we have, at least last winter, we had like 9 continuous days of footage to review. If you added up all of it after we took out the images of just vegetation blowing and people in front of it. So it takes a long time to get through all of that. So like when we publish our population report, that's sort of the summation of all of that, which is in part why when we get people online telling us we have no idea how many wolves are out there and things like that, it's really hard to be like, why don't you just come sit and watch this footage with us? Cause I can prove it. I have got it's got a timestamp on it. It's pretty good information. It's not like we're just like, well, yeah, we think there's 50 of them. We're trying to leave it so it's more of a census than an estimate. So it's not us just getting in the range. It's like, no, we know how many, almost to the number of it, so that we can also, it's not only for just the scrutiny, for our own understanding of saying like, we've got a really good estimate through time. So when we see a change, we know that is a meaningful change. It's not like an error or potential, not error, but just variation in our estimate that we can't account for. Like when you look at, like, let's say the state's estimate, they're obviously looking at wolves on a very large scale. And so they're going to have confidence intervals that are going to be plus or minus 500 wolves. Well, that's a lot. So for them to detect, let's say, meaningful change over time, that population is going to have to change a lot statistically for you to be able to say that is a meaningful decrease as opposed to a potential change in just sampling effort or something like that. We want it to be so that when we see a change, it's like, we know that's a meaningful change. It's not a statistical sampling error, not error, but sampling change. So we put a lot of effort in our cameras in the winter time.
And that's great to hear. It's more of a personable touch, the whole study, because anybody can throw it into a machine and ask for something, but.
Right. Well, and, since we know none of them listen, I think we can confirm on air here that all 3 of us have used AI to draft messages to our wives. Responses to our wives.
I can absolutely say I have done that.
I actually have not.
I have
And
not.
I tell you what, it was brilliant and it worked awesome.
Hey, Chat GPT, how would you respond to this?
And it's like, here, do this.
Disappointment. And it's like Wednesday disappointment.
Wow. But you
changed everything.
That's where you two differ from me, because I guarantee AI. I mean, if you could train AI to talk like me,
you can.
then it might work.
Like AI, third grade level.
Yeah. Third grade level, ignorant.
I like your hair.
Yeah. Because I guarantee she would know exactly. And honestly, if it was more than 4 words, she'd be like, you lied. That wasn't you.
Who wrote this for you? That word had 2 syllables.
Yeah, that definitely ain't me.
Oh man, but no, I see what you're saying, and I feel you with the comments about you're making up numbers, and I swear there's people out there that'll sit in a stand for 2 hours and they'll see one wolf and they'll be like, oh, 2 hours and I saw one. That's 12 wolves a day. That's I can't do the math on the top of my head, but that's 10 billion wolves a year, and that's how you get billboards. I'm going to beat you to that one.
That might be true. I do think that, the challenges with wolves when it comes to particularly sightings and particularly trail cameras is if you don't think about the information, if you don't put it in its context, it's really deceiving, right? So like you can put a camera out and get I can put a camera out in a spot and I can guarantee you I'm going to get tons of wolf videos, right? I know they're going to be there, but it's going to be the same 4 wolves going by that camera. But if you counted up and said, this is the number of deer photos, a number of wolf photos, if I gave you some of our footage and said, are there more wolves or deer on this image, individuals, they would say wolves for sure. Right. But actually it's not, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a artifact of where you place that camera. And so it's hard to get some folks to see that. And I think cameras, because of that, there's lots of pros of having cameras out, but there's also some where you have to think a little bit about the species, and it's just different. And sometimes people don't think about some of those things, or at least they. And I think some of it too is if you're inclined to think there's too many wolves, you're going to see that everything's going to confirm exactly what you think, right? So it's going to give you confirm that perspective. But with our work, we do want to genuinely know, so it will slow down every video to look at the wolf in slow motion, look for attributes. We've got a whole database of individual wolves that we've taken photos from our trail cameras. So it's sort of a library of all the individual wolves that we know exist or did exist in our study area, so we can reference it. So there's physical attributes, scars, whatever it might be that would let us know it's that individual. So, and that's been one of the things that's given us a lot of insight into population dynamics. I'd say other research in particularly forested areas prior to the advent of cameras, you'd never be able to get that resolution of data, right? And so we've been able to get a lot of, when you read our population reports, we have a lot of information there about the demographics of each pack, the members in each pack that you don't often see in a lot of the work done because we're using videos and going through it in that detail to try to extract that data.
I think it's so cool.
Right. I think basically what you have to do, Tom, and I'm going to put this all on you, is you got to find a way to take all this great data that you guys collect and make it, how do I say this without insulting anybody?
Digestible
for
that's still a big word.
I think you just did it. I think you just did it, and that's where I wanted to go. You had your first free webinar, which was all about wolves and deer, and it was great, right? I was on there. You were on for a bit.
I was on for a bit. Yep.
I apologize. I didn't do it. I'll be on the next one.
It's all right.
I won't say
but that was the first in a series, right? Yep. And the rest of them are behind a bit of a paywall. But where can folks go to get more info, to get signed up and get this information? Because I think the one you have tomorrow night.
Yeah, we've got one tomorrow. We got another one in March that I'm giving, which is on essentially what are the effects of wolves on ecosystems. That's a topic that often is used for particularly by people who are wolf advocates of why we need wolves all over the place, and looking at what does the science actually say about that. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about in March. And we've got another one in April, which is basically just focused on what does a year in our project actually look like on the ground, behind the scenes. Obviously, social media presents a certain perspective. We share a lot of the highlights and things, but it doesn't necessarily show what does our actual day-to-day look like or seasonal work look like. So that's the hope there, is to kind of share what does actually being a wolf biologist look like in real time. So people can go to our social media, and we've got links on most of our recent posts to access the webinar information. You can sign up, register there for either all of them or just one of them, and then we record them. So if you can't make it live, you can tune in. We'll put it on YouTube. Then you can tune in later. So that's a good way to do it, or just send us an email at our website or something like that to get signed up. And yeah, so we've been doing the webinar series for a couple years now, and it's been a nice way to share information and also get to chat, answer folks' questions. We usually spend about an hour, hour and a half, depending on how many questions there are, just answering whatever questions people want. And we will answer pretty much any question people have, regardless of what it is.
Yeah.
What was your question?
He was making fun of my trim.
So I had to do it. I asked when he was going to get his door trim put up, because it was propped up in the corner, cut to length already. And
same as my place, by the way.
I had to ask because I looked around behind me and I had the same exact situation.
I got all kinds of doors in my house that aren't trimmed in.
It's just sitting there. It'll get done.
Right.
That's what I keep saying. 12
but
years.
No, I will say, I think you guys do. It's you do a hell of a job with these webinars, and they're very informative. They're as unbiased as you can be. And yeah, you do take the time to answer any and every question. I mean, that webinar started at like 7:30 or 6:30.
Something. It was almost a 3.5 hour.
Yeah, it was like 10 o'clock by the time we got off that call, and that's impressive.
That is impressive.
I think that's the one. I mean, the one aim I think of a lot of that too is I think there's often this feeling that people have. I feel like when it comes to, like, let's say wolves or other species where they don't get to often actually talk directly or ask questions, or maybe even hard questions to the people who are doing the work. Like, if you feel like people have a feeling about the DNR, well, I don't ever get to meet the person who's doing the DNR work or ask them, what the hell,
right.
What's this, or how do I make sense of this? And I feel like we're in a unique position where we can do something like that. And it's not like we know. I was well aware, like, we're going to do a webinar on wolves and deer. Like, who knows how this is going to publicly available, what's going to happen. This could be an interesting experience, right? But it was also that strong feeling of like, well, like, this is a value to people who are genuinely curious, and to be able to answer questions that people have in real time, even if they're either kind of out there or, not very nice, or most of them are actually very, very reasonable questions. But making that sort of opportunity where someone who's interested in the topic can get feedback from the people doing the work. And, because oftentimes if you asked another agency of some sort, you're going to get maybe the social media communications person, right? You're not going to get to ask the person doing the work, or rarely that's going to be an opportunity. So it's been one of our things with the project as a whole, is just to try to make it accessible, and people can get in touch with me or other biologists on our work if they want to easily. It's not behind some wall where we're not going to talk to you because that's makes us uncomfortable to answer that question, or, something like that.
Yeah. And that's why Jared goes to a lot of the sports shows and public events, because people can, ask him the questions, or they come up to us and they ask a question, and it's obviously directed towards Jared.
Or they'll say something about Jared, and I'll be like, hey, here he is right here. Let's talk to him.
Sure.
So it works, and the people will respect that and like that better.
Well, and I haven't even talked to these guys about this yet, but your webinar the other day, kind of inspired me to do something similar with, I'm no PhD level expert on anything, but we get a lot of questions about, what is MDHA, or, there's a lot of rumors out there about MDHA. And so there's kind of inspired me to maybe just set up like an open forum, where I can give an overview. And like you did, they will be on mute, but they can type in their questions.
Right.
And I can answer those questions. And so I think that might be something we set up here.
Bad idea.
Post February, because we got to get through this.
This month. Right.
And I think it's also too, it's helpful, like with this, when we kind of felt like, okay, like, we're not in some sense like hiding from our perspective, like we're not just on the internet. Like, we're happy to like put ourselves out there, right? And like, if you don't like it, I'm okay. I can handle you telling me you don't like it, right? But at least like we can create that environment. And I think it actually in some sense is helpful. Like, we're not trying to hide anything. We're not trying to pull something, pull the wool over your eyes. We're just like trying to do our work to the best of our ability. Yeah. And I think that's also often better communicated in person, or at least virtually, where someone can see you, than like, oh, you have a social media post and people can argue about it, and whatever, and so I think that it was quite actually uplifting to get done with that webinar and be like, oh, that was actually nice. No one was like, I know there are some people who had their feelings because I know when they comment, you can see their name. And I'm like, oh, I recognize this person from their comments on our social media platforms. But nonetheless, it was still like generally positive, I would say. And I think that just is like, oh, that's nice. Like, it's nice to not have, like, if we shared any of the things I shared in that webinar on social media, it would just be one huge screaming match on social media. Right. And it's like, I don't really want to deal with that, you know? Whereas in something like that, it actually doesn't, it kind of almost takes the air out of it. Right. Because it's like, I'm not trying to like, you know, be conniving or something. It's just, you know, this is why we think what we think. That's it.
And at a bare minimum, it's like, hey, I'm a real person. Right. You know, I'm here. I'll answer your questions.
Well, and a lot of people on social media are just keyboard warriors, but when it comes to time to actually ask you the question, they wouldn't do it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, most people say things to us online that they would never tell me to my, and actually it's probably 100%. One of my biggest frustrations, I would say, is like, I don't care if someone disagrees with me. I'm more than happy to talk to just about anybody. But when people don't have the, I'd say, almost integrity to like come talk to me, like they'll go around on the internet and say something awful or whatever, but they won't actually reach out and say, I don't agree with what you said. I'd like to talk to you about it. Be like, okay, that's fine. I can respect that. But to like, I've had people who don't like it, and I'll be like, I'm happy to meet with you. And then they just ghost me. Right. And I think like, to me, I just think like, it's just kind of pathetic. Like, it's like, and it's a harsh word, but I kind of feel like, you know, I'm okay if you insult me, but if I offer you the opportunity to talk and you don't want to talk to me, like, I don't know. Like, I think that's really just sad, you know, and I think that does reflect a societal thing where you can go on social media, say what you want. There's minimal consequences on a personal level, but it's a lot harder to look at somebody who's being genuine and kind and just tell them you hate them.
Right.
You know,
I think it was at Game Fair where I had stepped out of the booth to take a phone call. And I came walking back, and there's some guy in your face just screaming about a rough one.
Oh boy!
Game Fair, was that Darren Turkey?
No, it was Game Fair.
It was Game Fair.
Yeah, he's just screaming about what a piece of shit I am.
He was.
And then, of course, we locked eyes.
Yeah, he is.
We locked eyes, and then you just turned to the guy and you said, "Well, he's right there." And so then I walked up and talked to the guy, and by the end of it, you know, he shook my hand, said, "Thank you, keep up the good work." And it's like, as soon as
he shifted gears.
As soon as you realize this is a real person, you know, just doing the best job they can do, it puts things in a new perspective.
And we've had that happen a few times. I know you weren't there that day, but it was at the Duluth Sports Show. And I don't know what day it was, but I think you were there. Or actually, it might have been the year that you guys weren't there. But anyways, this gentleman come up just attacking. So had a conversation. And by the end of it, same thing. You know, we agreed to disagree. But he was happy and shook my hand and actually took a Whitetails magazine that he probably just threw in the shitter later. But, you know, it was a good conversation. But at that 10 minutes later, we had a guy come in and attack, and he didn't want to listen to anything. I mean, he just attacked. So,
wow.
You know,
well, there are some just unpleasant people out there.
Yeah.
I don't know. My personal rule is, you know, speak about half the amount of time that you listen. Right. And if you can do that, I think you'll be a much better, happier, and more well-rounded human being.
Well, I actually thought, speaking of that, so I was reading, I'm guessing you guys all got outdoor news. Maybe. So there was it was a couple weeks ago, they had one on the DNR roundtable, and they're talking about the wolves, you know, wolf management, et cetera. And they're talking about how, I think it was, I can't remember if they're representatives or...
it was both. We had Senator Herr was there, and then 2 reps, Heinzman and
Fisher.
Okay,
yeah. So it was that. And then it was talking about in the editors, or I forgot what they call that section, in the first page there, right? And they were talking about how essentially Heinzman and Fisher, despite stark policy agreements, they mentioned it was nice to see them before all the things were happening. They were having breakfast together or something and clearly just enjoying conversation or something. And I thought that was sort of a refreshing little tidbit to hear, like, these people who have very contrasting perspectives, right, on an issue, but still being able on a personal level to connect and get along. And I think that's the one thing that's deeply missing on all sorts of issues, including, you know, the wolf issue, is like being able to recognize that, right, is like to be able to find that sort of common ground and appreciate people as people, and despite differences in perspective.
God,
so
it's bad when you're holding your politicians up on a pedestal as something to strive for.
But it's nice at least to hear, right?
Rare.
Like I'm not saying.
I agree with you.
Like it is rare to like hear about that, but I thought like it was just like refreshing to read something that's not about like just these people who just don't like each other, see the world fundamentally different, and aren't going to get along. Like as opposed to like they clearly have very different perspectives on that issue. But they still behind the scenes can get along
and
have
function
a conversation.
as human beings.
They actually they shared a boat at the governor's fishing opener last year, and have plans to share a boat together again next year.
So they enjoyed each other,
and they invited Senator Hur to come with them.
And nobody pushed each other over, or there's a hook in your ear. I don't know.
So I just think it's just refreshing little glimpses of, because it's like little glimpses of humanity, right? Of people being kind, right? And sometimes that seems lacking. And I'd say, we experience lots of people who are very unkind. And so it's like
sitting right next to two of them.
Right. So, but outside of Tom and Dean,
that's right.
Whatever.
Everybody be so sweet like me and Jared.
Yeah. Yeah. So sweet.
Yeah. We're the best people you'll ever meet.
Just ask us.
Yeah. Just ask my mom I'm perfect.
Where's that button?
Oh, man. But no, again, definitely encourage you all to check out the webinar series that Tom's putting on with Voyageurs Wolf Project. I think it's very informative. I think it's well-rounded, well-balanced. And
it's good information that's right in your backyard for most of us.
Right? And we all know you're going to take that information and form your own conclusions.
Absolutely.
But at least you'll have the information.
Exactly.
Right.
Just think of all the new ideas you can come up with.
Right. That's right. Big words you can learn.
Right.
Expand your vocabulary at a minimum.
I know. I love it.
I love when Tom's here because
that's why I record this so I can listen back, look up the words that he said.
Usually have to pause it, then type that into chat GPT. What's this mean? So yeah.
Oh man.
But yeah, no. It's always great to talk to you, Tom.
Sure. Well, I like coming down. It's nice. So
it's kind of becoming a, roughly Valentine's Day tradition.
It kind of is, but and I really appreciate that you're doing the deer study now because we have even more things to talk about.
And hopefully, like I said, in the coming years, hopefully once we get that really, a year or two in and get good data, we can share that information and talk about that. So, so we're excited. There's lots of fun things to talk about. And obviously we learn new stuff every year, it seems, or at least little bits.
Right.
And I'm sure there'll be plenty of this issue is never going to go away.
No.
Regardless of what happens. So there'll always be things to talk about.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm sure we'll have you back soon.
Sure.
Right.
Maybe next Valentine's Day.
If nothing else, for sure, next Valentine's Day.
Oh, man.
Unless you find some really cool discovery, about deer habitat or
something groundbreaking.
Groundbreaking. There you go. We want it first here.
Yes.
That's what I'll do. I'll let you know.
I can only imagine.
But thank you so much for being here, Tom. We always appreciate your perspective, and you're doing great work. So
thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for driving down before the big storm. If we do actually get a big storm,
if we do, and if I don't make it home,
that's Jared's fault because he jinxed you.
Yep. Blame Jared.
Definitely.
That's right.
It's easier that way.
Yeah.
Cool beans.
Sweet.
We'll see you later, Tom.
Thanks. That sounds good.
Have a safe drive.
The Minnesota Deer Hunters Association has been building our hunting and conservation legacy over the past 40 plus years through habitat, education, advocacy, and legislation in Minnesota for Minnesota.
The Minnesota Deer Hunters Association and wolf.report proudly sponsor this podcast. However, please note that the opinions, topics, and guests featured may not necessarily align with the views, beliefs, goals, or mission of our sponsors.